Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce today. See if you can guess which guy of the crowd here has something to do with the revolution. Yeah, good guess. So he's from the group called the Forgot. The presentation is on the Forgotten Victory Trail, the Battles of Springfield and Connecticut Farms. Now, Bob speaks about many topics of the revolution. He's tailored today's for our locale. So pay attention. It's going to be good stuff. Okay. Bob Gula, the Forgotten Victory Trail explores one of America's most overlooked revolutionary chapters in the brutal campaigns of 1780 in New Jersey, when burning towns, secret networks, and fierce local resistance helped turn the tide of the war. The battles of Springfield and Connecticut Farms in June 1780 were critical in the defense of New Jersey and Washington's forces in Morristown, and in the weakening of the British forces ahead of the Battle of Yorktown. Good job. Okay, so Bob, I introduce you. Please come up and you gonna wear your hat?
All right. Well, it's kind of hard to follow up the earlier jokes that we had, but I'm going to do my best to talk about the Forgotten Victory Trail. And I've condensed a lot of material into the short period that we're going to be here. So I apologize, number one, for the number of maps that you're going to see. There's a ton of maps. I love maps. But we're going to cover a lot of material. I'm going to try not to go down rabbit holes. I have a tendency to do that. But there are so many interesting mini stories within this story, and I think you're going to find it exciting. I know I do. So hopefully, this is pretty distant for most of you. The people on Zoom are going to have a much easier time of seeing some of these slides. But this is to give you a bit of a background about my journey to where I am in terms of my genealogy, my attachment to the Revolutionary War. And this shows my family tree, or at least one piece of it. And this is a shout out to my grandmother, circled right there, Luella Beach Gula. And as you probably gather, my last name is not really Anglo-Saxon Protestant. It's Eastern Bloc European. So 3 out of my 4 grandparents were of Polish ancestry. My grandmother, whose maiden name was Beach, would always say to me, "You're Irish, you're Irish." And she took my brother and I in our youth to Ireland several times. And I remember one incident. We're at the border with Northern Ireland, and she was from Tipperary. Her mom was from Tipperary. She was Quichen. And we're on the border to Northern Ireland, and this was in the 80s, so it was still kind of rough. And we go past the British troops with their rifles, and she goes, "Get the hell out of my country." Now, flash forward, my grandmother lived to be 97, and she died about 9 years ago. And she would always say, "You're Irish, you're Irish." And that's because her mom was a Quichen. Well, lo and behold, her maiden name is Beach, which goes way back in English roots. We go back to Mayflower. We go back to Plantagenet kings. So unfortunately, Grandma passed before she knew all this, or maybe she knew it and she just didn't tell me. But this slide shows Jehiel Day, who was a direct ancestor of my grandmother and myself. And he fought at the age of 18 in 1776. He fought for the American cause. He was a Morris County militia. And he lived out near the Great Swamp, which is going to come into play later when we talk about the Watchung Mountains and the Great Swamp and the effect on troops out in Morristown. So he signed up at 18, fought at the Battle of Springfield, which was in his pension records, which was really cool. Fun fact, hopefully this will work. Fun fact, I don't know if the Day name rings a bell to people, or whether or not you know the origins of Chatham. Before it was Chatham, it was named after one of the members of Parliament, the Earl of Chatham, because he was on our side during the Revolution, and he would advocate for us in the Parliament. But before that, it was called John Day's Bridge. That's Chatham's name. So it ends up that was Jehiel's uncle, was John Day, and he was one of the first settlers of Chatham. So I like to throw that in here as a point of reference. Also down the bottom, I mentioned that I have 6 other direct ancestors who fought for the patriot cause. And one of them that I found in my research was a Hessian soldier. It just so happened that he had come over in 1776, fought at the Battle of Saratoga, was captured, and it ends up at that point in the war, Washington had said no more exchanging of prisoners. It wasn't working because the British weren't playing fair. They weren't sending their troops back and not putting them back into combat. So he was made an indentured servant of a household in New Hampshire. He ends up falling in love with the daughter of the person that he's working for, and they elope, and then I end up here. So I had 1 Hessian and 6 American patriots. So I put this in here. This is appropriate because I realized we're in this Presbyterian church with a deep, long history. And I think one of the things that we forget about with the revolution is that so much of it is rooted in Enlightenment principles. The Great Awakening started it all in the 1740s. And so many of the Presbyterian ministers in our area were critical in espousing all of these radical ideas. The radical ideas were around liberty, independence, common sense. And I named just a few of the people that originated these concepts, like Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Jefferson, Paine, and they all voiced these principles. And the local ministers from this area were a big part of that. Reverend Caldwell, if you don't know who that is, was a big part of it. You also had Jacob Green out of Hanover, Timothy Johns out of Morristown. These guys during the Revolutionary period at their pulpit would espouse these principles, and they were the thing that we were fighting for during the Revolution. So the images that you see on your screen are generated. We used AI. We used some of our knowledge and tried to create images of what we thought the battles of Springfield, Connecticut Farms would look like. So these are images from the Forgotten Victory Trail and from our website. So early battles of the American Revolution. This list is not all encompassing, but I wanted you to get a sense of New Jersey's participation in the Revolution. The ones in red represent the ones that took place in New Jersey. Now there's some on here. This is the early part of the war. And some of these you may not recognize. I don't know if anyone's heard of the Forage Wars. New Jersey had forage wars. So what it was the British, who were on Manhattan Island and Staten Island, they occupied it from about August 1776 to the end of the war. The British needed to forage and go out and patrol to try and get supplies. They had a hard time feeding their horses. They had a hard time feeding their men. So they were short on many things. So they would go out and forage, and they would sometimes encounter militia who were defending their areas. So you can see we have a list of some of the forage wars that happened locally and throughout New Jersey. The second page, this has some of the later battles. The ones that get the most press in New Jersey are Monmouth, very large battle. Princeton, Trenton, 10 crucial days, right? Those battles, and those were on the earlier slide, they have large battlefields. They still have existing land. They have visitor centers. We don't have that here. So the Battle of Springfield, the Battle of Connecticut Farms, it's developed. We have roads and bridges, and it's urbanized. So it's very hard to picture what it was like during those battles. But all in all, there were over 700 battles and skirmishes and fighting in New Jersey. It represented 40% of George Washington's time was spent in the state of New Jersey. That's incredible. The other thing that I wanted to quickly highlight here, if you see below that solid line in the middle of the screen, there's a series of skirmishes and battles that took place in New Jersey after Yorktown. Now, did anyone watch the Ken Burns 5-part series? Yeah. Okay. Well, Ken Burns said nothing about Connecticut Farms or Springfield, which irked me. In addition, he omitted activity that took place after Yorktown. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the Blockhouse raid in Toms River, they burned the entire town of Toms River to the ground, the British. You had the Long Island Massacre. So there were all these events that took place after Yorktown in New Jersey, and some of these events would end up delaying the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The Blockhouse raid, Joshua Huddy, who was in charge of that fort, would be captured and hung by the British. George Washington would want to retaliate with a British soldier. He wanted to hang a British soldier. It ends up the mother of that British soldier appeals to the French king. The French king's part of the Treaty of Paris negotiations, and he says, Congress and George Washington, you need to, let this die. But that delayed the whole peace process. So I guess my point here is that a lot took place in New Jersey, and it's forgotten in history. So these battles like Connecticut Farms and Springfield and these skirmishes that took place in New Jersey after Yorktown were important. Another map. So this is a cool map that if you go online, you could probably find it, but it shows all of the skirmishes and fighting that took place in New Jersey. The area we're going to focus on today is circled in red. So that's the Forgotten Victory Trail. It goes from Elizabeth out to Morristown. And there were battles throughout the Revolution, but primarily in the months of January through June of 1780. Another map. You're going to see a lot of maps. This map is from 1781 with overlays that we did that shows the Forgotten Victory Trail. And what I want you to notice on this map, and maybe it's too far for the people in the audience to see, but you can see the topography. You can see that there's mountains. There's a mountain range in the middle of that. And there are 2 gaps in that Watchung mountain range. It was called the Blue Hills for a long time before it was named the Watchung mountain range. But there were 2 gaps within which you could pass through from one area to the next. One was the Hobart Gap. Everybody knows Short Hills Mall, Hobart Gap. So that was one of the gaps. The other one's the Mordecai Gap, which is down towards Bound Brook, Middlebrook, where the encampment, Washington had an encampment early in the war. Those 2 gaps were the only way through for troop movements if they wanted to get out to Morristown. So this is an example. This map is on a kiosk. We have national park type kiosks at the Forgotten Victory Trail. And we're going to place those in Union, Springfield, Elizabeth, Milburn, Morristown. So this is just an example of one of those maps. Another map. This one may be a little clearer, the areas we're talking about. So the red lines represent the routes taken by the British. The British will invade New Jersey twice in June of 1780. And they will take a route from Elizabeth. Remember, the British troops in 1780 are stationed out at Staten Island, which is a short little hop across the Arthur Kill to Elizabeth. And they would march out trying to reach Morristown, which is where Washington's encamped. So the first big events of 1780 are in January. In January, the British decide to raid. They're testing George Washington. They don't really know his troop size. They don't know what his intentions are. They know that he's behind this mountain range, They don't know what his strength is. So the British commander in New York will test him. They will raid 75 times in the month of January into Elizabeth. They'll end up burning Elizabeth to the ground, and they will burn the church of Reverend Caldwell in Elizabeth. As a matter of fact, they will be led by a loyalist named Cornelius Hatfield. His father is a patriot. The son is a loyalist. He will burn his own church, the Reverend Caldwell's church, and that would be at the end of 1780. The Americans, in the middle of January 1780, they will make an attempt. Lord Stirling, William Alexander, who's a general for George Washington, will attempt to raid Staten Island. And as we'll get to later, the winter of 79 to 80 is so cold that everything freezes over. The Arthur Kill's frozen over, the Hudson River's frozen over. So it's an easy walk from Staten Island to Elizabeth and vice versa. So moving forward, a few months later in June, the first week of June, the British will invade the first time. This will be a major invasion of a large number of troops. The number of troops that they're going to have invading is second only to Monmouth in the battles that take place in New Jersey in terms of troop count. So they will go and we'll get into details here, but they will march through Elizabeth into Connecticut Farms, which is we now call Union, and they will burn that town to the ground. 2 weeks later, they will do the same and take the same route, get a little bit further into New Jersey, and be stopped very close to the Hobart Gap in Milburn and in Springfield. So why did George Washington pick Morristown as his encampment? Well, George Washington by trait is a surveyor, right? He knows the land, he knows topography, he knows the importance of defensive positions. In this case, he picks the place that's about 11 miles from the Watchung Mountain Range, which is then 11 miles from Elizabeth and New York City. So it's equidistant. It allows him to be in a defensive position. He can go to New York if he wants to. But one of the reasons that it's there is the fact that there was a glacier that receded. And at one point, we actually had a Lake Passaic, which occupied all of the area you see in blue, was one giant lake. Now, once that lake dissipated, we're left with the Great Swamp. So not only would the British have to get over the Watchung Mountain Range, but they'd have to get through the Great Swamp. So number of good reasons to camp out in Morristown. In addition, it's a very patriotic town. The population of Morristown is 250 people. How many troops do you think Washington rolls into town with in 1779 winter? 10,000. So imagine if you're one of those 250 people and all of a sudden 10,000 troops come into town. They had experienced this before in an earlier winter, 1776 to 77, they were out at Morristown. They camped near Lowentaka, which is on the border of Harding and Chatham. So they camped there, and the officers were billeted in private homes. But they had a number of issues that first time in terms of putting troops up in houses, supply issues, smallpox epidemic. So they had a number of issues the first time. The second time they will find a piece of land, Henry Wick's land. Henry Wick was the largest landowner in Morristown and in, I guess, that surrounding area. So he had 1,400 acres of land. George Washington came to him and said, "We'd like to pay you to use this land." And he said, "No, I'm a captain in the militia and this is my obligation." So he let them stay on his acreage They would end up felling tons of trees, of course, to supply the wood for their encampment. Interestingly enough, so Henry Wick is this very patriotic individual, very generous with his land. His father is John Wick from East Hampton, Long Island. And this is one of those cool stories that you find out only because he's related to me. So I'm digging and I see Henry Wick's an uncle, like 5 times great uncle. John Wick, his father, is a direct ancestor of mine. And John Wick had a Wick's Tavern out in East Hampton, Long Island in the late 1600s, early 1700s. John Wick, legend has it, you would go to his tavern and you wouldn't come out. So he was a mass murderer, a serial killer. So yeah, you can't make this stuff up. So Henry Wick, patriot. John Wick, kind of a kook. But so that's Henry Wick's story. The other thing to mention is at this point in 1779, 1780, Morristown is strategically important because it is behind those mountains. There are iron mines in Sussex County, which will supply iron to George Washington. It's very pro-patriotic. Timothy Johns is a pastor. He's Presbyterian. He's an Enlightenment man. He's vocal. The Congress at this point is about 3 years old. So the nation is 3 years old. They don't have any money. They haven't paid their troops. There's desertions going on within the ranks of George Washington's troops. They have supply issues. There's very little food. So it's miserable enough with those things. And then they get hit with 26 snowstorms, 6 blizzards. In some records, this is the worst winter in North American history. So picture the troops in misery out in Morristown. As a matter of fact, George Washington has a lot of correspondence, and his aides have correspondence with the Congress where they're saying, we need help. We need money. We need food. Please help us. Well, the Congress kind of ignores it for a while. They say, yeah. Well, they send 3 representatives out there to investigate. They send an investigative committee. They come out, they spend a week, and kind of mill around. They look around. And then one of them jumps on a horse at the end, rides to Philadelphia and tells the Congress it's way worse than he says. So another thing to know about Morristown, it's when Lafayette brings news to Washington about French participation in the war, which is well needed. And it is our first national historic park in the nation, was Morristown. So now we're going to talk about some of the main characters. George Washington, you all know. Nathaniel Greene is a Rhode Island Quaker, and these gentlemen are going to be involved in these battles that we're going to talk about further. Nathaniel Greene, he is Washington's right-hand man, and arguably he's one of the best officers under George Washington. Benedict Arnold, yes, very good tactician. Nathaniel Greene does whatever George Washington wants him to do, he steps up. So, for example, Nathaniel Greene, battlefield commands. George Washington says, you know what? I got supply issues. Can you be my quartermaster? And Nathaniel Greene goes, oh, geez. But he does it, and he does it very well. So he's willing to do what George Washington wants, and he will fight in major battles during the Revolution. He will clean up the supply issues in the quartermaster's unit. Scotch Willie Maxwell, interesting character. Yes. Yeah. So he said that if anything should happen to George Washington, he said that Nathaniel Greene should take over. And I agree with that sentiment. Despite the fact that he was a Quaker just 6 years prior to the Revolution, he ends up being one of Washington's best officers. Now, George Washington will have a couple of troublemakers, amongst his officers, Horatio Gates, Charles Lee. There's stories that could be told about those gentlemen. And they would be envious of him. They would look to they would like his position. They all think that they could do a better job than Washington. But the one thing that Washington is able to do with his commanding officers and his troops is to instill trust in them. And in this case, these gentlemen, he trusts thoroughly. Scotch Willie Maxwell, hard drinking. He will come into play at the Battle of Connecticut Farms, and he will be in charge of troops there. Light Horse Harry Lee, probably everybody knows that's Robert E. Lee's dad. He was a hero during the Revolution. And he will come to the aid of Washington as Washington is short on cavalry. So by 1780, Washington's in need of cavalry. He calls Light Horse Harry Lee up from Virginia. And he will be critical at Vauxhall Bridge, which is on the border of Milburn and Vauxhall, New Jersey, which is part of the Battle of Springfield. And then last but not least, Israel Angle. He's in charge of the 2nd Rhode Island, which will see battle, will be in many of the important battles of the Revolution. And he will fight at the Galloping Hill Bridge. So we have a pretty cohesive group of leaders on the Patriot side. On the other side, we have Sir Henry Clinton in charge of North American troops. He's taken over from William Howe. Henry Clinton will end up being the longest tenured commander in North America for the British. He's proper British gentleman, doesn't trust anyone over the rank of colonel. He doesn't really have much confidence in himself, and he's very secretive. He doesn't like to give away his plans, even to his commanding officers within his ranks. And that's going to be important later on as we get towards the Battle of Springfield. Kniphausen is a Hessian. He doesn't speak a word of English. He's in charge of troops in New York after Henry Clinton decides to go down to Charleston to take Charleston in December of 1779. So he will leave Kniphausen in charge in New York. Kniphausen has a translator. They probably spoke French, which was kind of like the universal language between the Brits and the Germans. But he has a translator. But imagine, I think about the fact that Kniphausen, the communication between these two must have been very difficult in battlefield situations. And it's made worse by the fact that Henry Clinton is very secretive about his plans. So behind the scenes, we've got antagonists. I call these guys the antagonists. You know the one on the upper left, that's William Franklin, illegitimate son of Benjamin Franklin, royal governor of New Jersey. He is arrested and sent to prison early in the war. He's arrested at Perth Amboy at his little mansion. And he gets sent away. And while he's away, his wife dies of disease. So he's a staunch loyalist, always has been. When his wife passes away and he's finally released, he wants revenge. So he forms this board of associated loyalists. He tries to generate his own little army. He tries to influence greatly Henry Clinton, the commanding officer of the British in New York. And next to him is William Tryon. William Tryon is one of these savage battlefield commanders for the British. He is the former royal governor of New York. He's attacked several Connecticut coastal cities, burned them to the ground. So he's on the bad side of Henry Clinton because Henry Clinton is not happy with that kind of aggression on the battlefield. To the right is Major General James Robertson. His nickname, he's in charge of, at least pre-war, he's in charge of the barracks in New York. He's now the royal governor of New York. And his nickname is Old Clip. Can anybody guess why he would be called Old Clip? Well, I'll tell you. When he would exchange money, he would clip shavings off of his coins to short you. and then he would save the clippings and kind of remelt them. And so he was a cheapskate. Old clip. All right. Last but not least, William Smith. He's a lawyer. He's part of a prominent family in New York. He's originally on our side. He's I'll call him a patriot, but he refuses to take the oath of allegiance to the United States, and in turn is thrown out. So he's deported by the rebels early in the war. Then he turns into a loyalist. And the consistent thing amongst all these gentlemen is they have firm belief that the British overestimate the strength of the American patriots, particularly in New Jersey. Now, they kind of think of Henry Clinton as George McClellan, the George McClellan of the Revolution. George McClellan would always overestimate the size of his competitor's army. In this case, they thought Henry Clinton was doing the same. They also felt that there was this innate loyalist sentiment within New Jersey. Now, if you listen to historians, they'll say the population was generally 1/3 patriot, 1/3 loyalist, 1/3 neutral. Well, it depended on where you were. If you were in New Jersey and you were in Perth Amboy, it's probably pretty much loyalist. If you were in Morristown, it was pretty much all patriot. But Bergen County would be mostly loyalist because of the Dutch influence there. Monmouth County had a lot of loyalists. Sussex County had a lot of loyalists. The other counties were pretty much majority patriot. But they felt like once we get in there and have an impact and show George Washington who's boss, the loyalists will come out of the woods. But what they underestimated was the spirit of independence and liberty that all of these citizens had. So they will end up getting in the ear of Kniphausen because Henry Clinton, as I mentioned, in December of 1779, he takes troops, goes down to Charleston. He wants to sever the colonies in half. When he leaves, he says, okay, Kniphausen, you're in charge. But he doesn't give Kniphausen any commands. Basically leaves him with no marching orders. They will take this opportunity, these antagonists, to get in his ear. So, June 7th, actually the night of June 6th, they will invade and they will come across the water in Elizabeth, and they will land at two places, the Harts Point and Elizabethtown Point. And they will make their way through Elizabeth into what was then Connecticut Farms, which is now Union. And this is what it looks like today. There are certainly no cranes back then, but this is the park that's in Elizabeth where the British landed for that first invasion. So if the British have landed in Elizabeth, how's the message going to get out to George Washington? He's got spy networks. He's got scouts. He's got troops located in Elizabeth, but Elizabeth changes hands quite often because it's so close to Staten Island and New York. So how's the signal going to get out? Well, signal beacons, several of which we know are local. We've got the Summit Beacon, which was located on Beacon Hill near Beacon Hill Country Club. But there are 23 beacons that Washington commissions to be made all along the Watchung Mountain Range. So he tells Lord Stirling William Alexander, one of his generals, to create these beacons. They're 18 feet high, and they run from northern New Jersey down the Watchung Mountain Range. And there's supposedly the southernmost one is at Twin Lights, which is in the Highlands today. And if you haven't been there, it's a pretty cool lighthouse. And this is what it would have looked like. So it's 18 feet high, series of logs. On top of it is a tar barrel. The tar barrel and this brush would be ignited, and the whole thing would go up in flames. and it would be a warning beacon to Washington. Remember, he's 11 miles from the Watchung Mountain Range, which is 11 miles from where the British have landed in Elizabeth. So it's a perfect point. It's elevated and it's equidistant from Morristown to where the enemy's landed. There's a replica of it at Reeves Reed Arboretum over in Summit. And this was a number of years ago. So that's the replica. It's a scaled down version. But a number of years ago, there was a marker that was obscured by a bunch of plants that was cleaned out by a number of local historians. And that monument is at 226 Hobart Avenue in Summit. So you could visit that. It's right, you'd have to park on a side street, but it's right close to where the Beacon Hill Country Club is. Now, interesting story. I live at 123 Hobart in Short Hills. And I will sometimes get packages for 123 Hobart in Summit. So somehow one of my packages went to the Summit 123 Hobart. And she calls me and she got my contact information. She said, I got one of your packages. And I said, oh, you're at 123 Hobart in Summit? And I said, you're right near the beacon marker. And she goes, beacon? What beacon? So even though it's right down the street, it's literally right down the street. She had no idea, but she was very excited to hear about the fact that there was a beacon right there. So now we're moving on to Battle of Connecticut Farms. Remember I said Henry Clinton kept everything close to the vest. He instructed his aide-de-camp while he was away. He said, look, you can hint to some of these plans. He told his aide-de-camp about this. He didn't tell Kniphausen about his plan. He has a secret invasion plan. He tells his aide-de-camp about it, but says, no, just you can hint around the edges, but don't tell him what my plan is. So what his plan was is that on his way back from Charleston, he's going to drop his troops off at Perth Amboy, and they're going to march through the Mordecai Gap. Remember that earlier map? That was the southernmost gap in the Watchung Mountain Range. At the same time, he was going to have Kniphausen go through the Hobart Gap. So there was going to be attack from two different locations to try and flank Washington and get out to Morristown. So this is in his head, and it's with his aide-de-camp, but it's not with Kniphausen. So he ends up victorious. This is Henry Clinton. He ends up victorious in Charleston in May of 1780. And he's on his way back, and he's dropping his troops off at Perth Amboy. And he's going to make Kniphausen aware of his plan. He hasn't yet. When he gets one of his letters of correspondence from a gentleman he's been working with named Mr. Moore. Does anybody know who Mr. Moore might be? Benedict Arnold. So, of course, he's had this, they're trying to attract Benedict Arnold to the British side. And Benedict Arnold, or Mr. Moore in this case, has written him and said, look, I'm about to get this field command at West Point. I'm going to be in charge of that. So it's going to be in play. Well, Henry Clinton finds out through that letter and decides to change this plan. And he decides instead to go back up, meet with Kniphausen, and send some troops up towards the Hudson, towards West Point, because he knows that might be easily gained once Benedict Arnold kind of hands it to him. So here's the initial plan. It doesn't go through. I wonder, had they gone through with this plan, would things have changed? We end up successfully defending the second invasion by the British. But had they done this, Washington would have been outnumbered on both sides of the gap here. Both troop numbers would have outnumbered him, and he would have been taken by surprise, I think. So this is a regimental list. This is an order of battle. It's very detailed. Not going to go through all the units that were involved, but the number you need to know is down the bottom, which is the Americans, including militia, are outnumbered 4-1. There are 1,500 Patriot soldiers against 6,000 British and Hessian. So the question is, okay, how are they going to defend against 4-1 odds? Well, they know the terrain. The Continental Army soldiers have New Jersey regimental units that know the local areas. The militia certainly knows the local areas. They're fighting with guerrilla tactics. The British, they don't have the best maps. Some say that they even got lost on the way to Connecticut Farms. So the Americans will fight dirty. They will fight with less men, but more knowledge of the terrain. More maps. This depicts the British route taken for Connecticut Farms. Remember, this is the first invasion. So they will get out to Connecticut Farms and they will meet at what's called the Defile in Connecticut Farms, which is at the base of a hill. And this map, just so you know, this is one of the maps that's going to be on one of our future kiosks in Union. And it depicts troop movements for Connecticut Farms. So here's the route they take. They go up Morris Avenue, past Liberty Hall. They make a left on Colonial Avenue, end up going up Chestnut Street. And if these aren't familiar to you, it may be in a minute. And they end up right near the Presbyterian Church at Connecticut Farms. Not far from where Costco is, by the way. And there's the battlefield today. The entrance ramp to the Parkway. So remember I was saying we've got large battlefields at Trenton, Princeton, Monmouth. This is ours. So this was, of course, not like this. Connecticut Farms, interestingly enough, Connecticut Farms, George Washington called it the Garden of Eden of New Jersey. Union, he called the Garden of Eden of New Jersey. It was orchards, it was fields, it was farms, it was beautiful. So you have to kind of dig in to realize that there were no bridges, there were no roadways. But when I show this photo to the kids and I say, do you ever go down the shore during the summer and take the shortcut to get on the Parkway? And they're like, yeah. And they're like, oh, I know where that is. Well, there was a battle there. So that's right down the street from Connecticut Farms Church. That's an artist depiction. That's what the church looked like in the early 20th century. That's what it looks like today. So you've probably gone past it, I'm sure, in your journey. But there's no major signage. There's no informational kiosk, and it's our desire to put one across the street in one of the parks. James and Hannah Caldwell, if you've heard the story, I'm sorry for repeating it, but Reverend Caldwell was one of those high-powered Presbyterian leaders who was very vocal in his advocacy for the Patriot cause. He would come to the pulpit, legend has it, and he would put his revolvers up on the pulpit, and then he would do his sermon. But he along with his wife, they've escaped the carnage in Elizabeth. Remember, the British burned that to the ground in January. He's moved out to a rental at a parsonage in Union. So he and his wife have 9 children. Danger lurks, of course, because the Battle of Connecticut Farms is British have invaded and they're coming up Morris Avenue, which is Galloping Hill Road back then. And they send 7 of the children away. Hannah says, I'm not going to take my infant on a bumpy ride out to Chatham to my sister-in-law's, to my sister's house. So I'm going to stay put. Plus, you've got these manuscripts, Reverend Caldwell, that I need to make sure is safe. So she says, I'm a patriot. I'm going to stick around. So she and her 3-year-old and her 6-month-old are in their rental, and the British are down the street. And of course, a 3-year-old, when they hear all this like cannons booming and gunshots and things like that, he supposedly is going to the window. They're in the bedroom and she's nursing the infant, and he keeps going to the window. So she gets up from the bed. There is a nursemaid there, I'm told, but she gets up from the bed to shush him away from the window, and she's shot twice by a British soldier. Now, after the war, there will be different versions of that story from each side. But you can imagine when word gets out that Patriot Parson Caldwell's innocent wife, Hannah, has been murdered by the British. You know, it gets in the press, it gets by word of mouth. The militia comes out in force. And that is a rallying cry. And the press definitely exploits it to the benefit of the Patriot cause. So, Reverend Caldwell, by the way, besides his day job as pastor, he's also quartermaster for the 3rd New Jersey Regiment, which is Elias Dayton's regiment, and he's chaplain. So he does a lot of work for the Continental Army. He's known as the fighting parson to patriots, and he's known as the rebel high priest to the British. And he, if I had to put together a list of the most wanted men in New Jersey during the Revolution, it would probably be Washington's number 1, right? They want to kidnap him. Then there's William Livingston, the American governor of New Jersey, very outspoken also. And then Reverend Caldwell is 3rd. So he's very much a wanted man. So he will sometimes speak out at the First Presbyterian Church in Springfield, Connecticut Farms Church in Union. Hannah will become legendary. And this is an image that we created that Union County is using as the official image. It's, again, we used a photograph of her grandchild from the 1850s, and we kind of made presumptions about what she might look like. And this is what we generated, and it's the official portrait for Union County. But there's the parsonage. You could visit. It's a museum. Union Township Historical Society has a little museum there. The British, after they killed Hannah, her body was removed. Thankfully, there were neighbors around, but then they burned the house to the ground. You're going to see kind of a trend here with the British. The British in these battles will get frustrated. They'll get frustrated because Patriot troops, militia, Continentals are fighting behind rocks, up in trees. And they're advancing, the British are, but they're not getting as far as they need to. And they'll end up retreating, and in their retreat, they'll burn things. And they burn Hannah and James Caldwell's house to the ground. You probably know this because you live in Union County if you live here. But this is the only seal of a county in the United States that shows a murder. So there's Hannah being shot by a British soldier, and there was major hoopla on this. Last year, the year before, I know I wrote a letter. They wanted to swap out this seal, which has been around a long time. And they wanted to put one with an airplane over Newark Airport. There were 4 sections to this new seal, and one had like an airplane flying over the airport, because that's in Elizabeth's in Union County. So luckily they said, no, we'll hold off on this changing the seal. But people were peeved that it was showing a murder. Okay, the furthest they'll get at Connecticut Farms is the east branch of the Rahway River on Morris Avenue. I'm going to show you a picture in a minute. That's what it looks like looking west on Morris Avenue. So that's the furthest they will get. They will encounter vigorous fighting from the undermanned militia and Continentals. Remember, the Continentals, there's 2 good stories here. One is militia comes out in force. George Washington, in the early years of the war, did not have a lot of confidence in the militia. He would often say, I'm not counting on the militia. because they haven't proven themselves. They come out in force here, but also the fact that the Continentals have just gone through one of the worst winters. Some of them are shoeless. They haven't been paid. They haven't been fed. So there's two heroes here. I think the militia and the Continentals both deserve praise for fighting as hard as they did. So facing resistance, the British turn around and retreat. They end up turning around in a rainstorm. Hence, we have this image that we created with the lightning bolt, because it was heavy torrential rains. But again, they burn Connecticut Farms to the ground. Kniphausen had made the decision to go it without his boss there. Now, this will come back to haunt him in a couple of weeks when his boss shows up again back in New York. But afterwards, about a month after this, he says, I really underestimated the disposition of the people in New Jersey. And remember, that disposition that he felt he had was because of those antagonists. Those antagonists, those loyalists had said, yeah, they'll come out. They'll help us. They really didn't. And he admits this to the Secretary of State of Great Britain, Lord Germain, in a letter. All right, Battle of Springfield. So they wait a couple of weeks. There's skirmishing in between, just so you know. Connecticut Farms, invasion number 1 takes place June 6th, 7th. British retreat to Elizabethtown. They don't go over to Staten Island, but they entrench themselves in Elizabethtown. They wait until 2 weeks later, and there's skirmishing occurring. George Washington makes a couple attempts to just harass the British in Elizabeth. But then Henry Clinton, General Clinton, comes back, and they make a second attempt. Another order of battle. 3-1. I'm sorry, yes, 3-1 number of troops this time. So we're outnumbered 3-1. But they take the same routes, and they end up. Remember, we saw that invasion plan that showed a two-prong attack through the gap, to the 2 gaps. This is a 2-prong attack through Union. So one will take the Galloping Hill Road, which is Morris Avenue, and one will take the northern route down Vauxhall Road. You're going to see pictures of this so you know what I'm talking about. But the British attacked on both flanks. And by the way, fun fact, before this Battle of Springfield in June of 1780, there was a first Battle of Springfield, which occurred in December of 1776. Very few troops. I think there was 500 troops. But the British made an attempt to get through the gap in December. Now, remember, December 1776 is when Washington's taking his route through New Jersey after he's been defeated in New York. He's coming across New Jersey on his way to the Delaware. And he will cross back over the Delaware about 3 weeks after this. So they successfully repel the British in that first Battle of Springfield. Oh, one thing to emphasize. I think I mentioned this before. Battle of Springfield will have the second most combatants in a battle in New Jersey after Monmouth. Monmouth has 25, 30,000 troops total fighting. This one has about 8, but it's the second highest of all the battles, but it gets no press. So here we are back at the same place. We go through Connecticut Farms. We go past where Hannah's murdered. We go out one flank, takes Vauxhall Road. The other goes up Morris Avenue. Okay, so now you can see where they're headed. They're headed towards the Hobart Gap. These are modern maps. The Washington Rock, where Washington will periodically look out over the troops, is at South Mountain Reservation today. So they split their forces and they attempt to flank. Now, the Vauxhall Bridge fighting, important thing first. Keep in mind through all of this, the plan of General Greene, who's in charge at the Battle of Springfield. Washington is not there, just so you know. Washington has taken his troops. He kind of wants to shadow his supply lines up towards West Point. So he takes a number of troops. And at this point, on June 23rd, he's at Rockaway Bridge. Rockaway Bridge is today Parsippany. So that's where he is. So he's not able to assist in the Battle of Springfield, but he's put General Greene in charge. And General Greene instructs his troops. He's got a number of defensive positions from Elizabeth back towards Springfield. So he's got like 5 different defensive positions where he's put troops. He's going to slow them so that if he does need reserves, he has the time to get his reserves to the Hobart Gap. So he commands his troops as they're retreating. They're doing what's called a fighting retreat. They know they're outmanned. They're sometimes being outflanked, but they want to slow British progress as much as possible. As they go backwards, they pull up the planks from each bridge, each successive bridge, to slow the British. Now, the British will end up going through the water over tiny planks. There are stories of British troops with great balance going across what's left of the bridge. But the Rahway River would have been much higher back then. It would have been probably 3 or 4 feet as opposed to a trickle, which it is today. So this is where Light Horse Harry Lee, remember, he's a Patriot general, Patriot major, and he will meet Edward Matthew and John Graves Simcoe of the British at this bridge. Does anybody see where that is? Do you know where Five Guys is? Do you know where Staples is in Union? Staples and Five Guys? That's in the distance. That bridge that you cross over to go from Milburn Ave onto Vauxhall, that bridge was major fighting. So there's little plaques there that tell you a little bit about it. The kids, when I do the school talks, they love this part because I'll say, do you know where Five Guys is? And they're like, yeah. And I said, you could see a battlefield if you go to Five Guys. But this is where, has anybody seen the series that was on called Turn? Okay, well, it was about the American Revolution. It's about spy networks. There's a villain in that. His name is John Graves Simcoe. He's in charge of the Queen's Rangers. The Queen's Rangers they're depicted as very fiendish, and they were. They used dramatic tactics during battle. Queen's Rangers are made up of loyalists, so loyalist Americans, plus, British soldiers. John Graves Simcoe is at this battle. He's a villain. And he's evil. If you ever see these shows, so remember that name, John Graves Simcoe. He fights against Light Horse Harry Lee, Robert E. Lee's dad. So I find it very interesting that these guys were right near where we live, fighting. So Light Horse Harry would face great odds, and he would defend against, I think there were no cannons, no artillery on the American side, and 3 cannons on the British side firing down on him. But he would slow them enough, and the British would end up coming down Milburn Ave, then called Vauxhall Road. So that's the first stop. This is Washington Rock, which you can go visit. Lafayette, Caldwell, von Steuben, George Washington, they would all, at one point or another, look out over Springfield, either before the Battle of Connecticut Farms or in between the battles. They would be up on this rock. This is the furthest that right flank of the British would get, is downtown Milburn. In front of the town hall, there's a rock with a commemorative plaque that says, this is the furthest the British got. Now, the British would get to this point. Edward Matthew was in charge of that flank of the British. Edward Matthew, along with John Graves Simcoe. Simcoe would try and flank in the middle of Milburn by going up towards the Paper Mill Playhouse. Believe it or not. So John Graves Simcoe was at one time near the Paper Mill Playhouse. But Matthew would get to downtown, what's today downtown Milburn. He would look up, and what do you think you see? If you're looking towards the Hobart Gap, you see mountains on each side. You've got South Mountain, Newark Mountain, I think it's sometimes called. And then you've got the Watchung Mountain Range. And up on those mountains, they'd been delayed so much, you see artillery, you see militia, you see Stark's brigade, Maxwell's brigade. So Edward Matthew, the British commander, looks up and says, we can't do it. It's a gauntlet. So he turns left and goes down Main Street into the middle of Springfield to meet up with Kniphausen. But just remember, downtown Milburn was some of the last fighting of the Revolution in northern New Jersey. In the northern colonies. And right downtown, the Reverend Caldwell had a quartermaster location, which is at what's today the Milburn Standard. Has anybody ever been to the Milburn Standard? Okay. Well, it's a restaurant downtown. It used to be called 40 Main, the restaurant. People that go to the paper mill sometimes eat here. But that used to be a quartermaster site for James Caldwell. And then Bryant's Tavern, this one you should know. Bryant's Tavern was right here on the border of Summit and Springfield, right around where ShopRite is today. Behind ShopRite. There's Bryant's Park, but this is where General Greene would meet with George Washington. So again, we've paved over our history. Okay. This is showing where the Galloping Hill Bridge is. So that, we already talked about Simcoe, Matthew going down Vauxhall Road. At the same time, Kniphausen is going down Morris Avenue, which was then called Galloping Hill Road. And they face, the first group of American troops that they face are the 2nd Rhode Island under Israel Angle. So he's got 160 troops in his 2nd Rhode Island regiment. And they're at this bridge, and they're facing 2,000 British. They successfully delay for 45 minutes, an hour, just enough time for more reserves to come to their aid in the rear. So there's a plaque near a bridge. And that's in the distance is Morris Avenue in this picture. And one of the side roads, you have Israel Angle plaque. Okay, more maps. This is just showing you downtown. The fighting occurred around where Springfield Library is today. There's an aerial shot. This shows you where the church is. This is downtown Springfield now. The second branch of the Rahway River, a little stream runs through there. You can see where it says second stream. And Israel Shreve. Oh, I can point with my mouse. So where the second stream is, this is where the 2nd New Jersey Regiment under Israel Shreve has been positioned by General Greene. And they're going to make a defense. Remember, the British are moving forward, slow pace. We're slowing them down, and we get to the second stream, and they're slowed even further. And across the road, before we get to that. So has everybody heard the Give 'em Watts boys story? Okay, most people have. Okay. There's nothing I can really add to this other than the fact that Isaac Watts had great hymnals, and that's what Reverend Caldwell used. Remember, Reverend Caldwell is kind of quartermaster / chaplain. So he's there while Israel Angle and his Rhode Island troops are battling, 10 times the force they have at that first bridge. They're at a wadding. The wadding helps to kind of make sure that the bullets coming from your rifle are more accurate. And they're at a wadding. So he goes to the rear, goes to the Springfield church, grabs these hymnals, and starts tearing pages out and giving it to the troops. And he says, "Give them Watts, boys." Because Isaac Watts is the hymnal composer. So this portrait is in France's Tavern, which if you've never been to France's Tavern, this is where Washington gives his final address to his troops at the end of the war. And it's a great place, one of the oldest taverns. Sadly, Reverend Caldwell is murdered in Elizabethtown about a year after this. So Hannah dies in June. Reverend Caldwell is murdered in November of 1781. He's in Elizabethtown. I think he's escorting a friend's daughter through Elizabethtown, and one of the American guards is a supposed spy or on the side of the British, and he kills Reverend Caldwell. That man, James Morgan, I believe his name is, James Morgan, will be hung at the gallows in Westfield. And there's a monument to that you could visit today in Westfield. There's the church in olden days, artist rendering. That's the church today, downtown. That's Springfield Presbyterian Church. Called the Cannonball House. That's the home of the Springfield Township Historical Society. They have a great museum. It's called the Cannonball House because it had a cannonball embedded in the side of it. It was found years after the battle. And lo and behold, the cannonball was from the good guys. It was from the Patriot side. So it had been embedded in the west wall of the Cannonball House. The Cannonball House was allowed to not be burned down because the British were led around when they were burning buildings in Connecticut Farms. They left 3 or 4 buildings standing, in Springfield. Loyalists identified this one as a loyalist house, and it was also a hospital for British soldiers. So they left it unburned, but the rest of Springfield they burned. Real quick, this is the graveyard across from the library in Springfield that houses many Revolutionary veteran graves. And you can't even see it because it's overgrown, but the DAR takes good care of the cemetery itself, but there's a little set of stairs that you can go up. That's what it used to look like. I don't have a picture of it today other than that, but it's there's a lot of heroes there from the Battle of Springfield. Okay, so they get as far as yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, I've heard the same thing. Unfortunately, that graveyard was much bigger at one point. It was spread out wider. And I know this because I just spoke on the battles at Springfield Library last week. And someone mentioned that graveyard had once been much larger. So I don't know how far out it extended, and I don't know whether the bodies were moved, but yeah. So the British only get so far. They see reserve troops up in the mountains. It's late in the day. They know that they can't get much further, and they're going to face this gauntlet of Patriot guns. So they turn around, they head back to Elizabeth and eventually Staten Island. In the process, and this is something that's not covered much, in their retreat, they are chased by savage patriots who are very angry. Because imagine your town, if you're from Springfield, has been burned. So they're chasing the British down Galloping Hill Road, which is Morris Avenue. They're chasing them down Vauxhall Road. They're chasing Simcoe. So all the way back to Elizabeth, they're under fire as the British are retreating. And there's tales of soldiers on the side of the road, stripped naked British soldiers that have been, just abandoned on the side of the road, dozens of them. So it's an awful scene. And think about this. We think of the Revolutionary War as British against Americans and British and Hessians, but it really, in many cases, it was a civil war also. You had loyalist units. You had what are called New Jersey Volunteers, was a British regiment of local colonists fighting for the British. They were called the New Jersey Volunteers, and they were involved in some of the heavy fighting that we just talked about. The Vauxhall Bridge, the Queen's Rangers also included New Jersey Volunteers, which was a loyalist unit. Okay. One last story. Anybody heard of the bread oven ruse? No? Okay, some people. Okay. So this is interesting because it's on the border of what's today Summit and Chatham. So you know where the 9-hole municipal golf course is in Summit? Okay. Well, on that golf course in 1781, George Washington had French soldiers construct bread ovens. It was August 1781. He's about to embark on a journey down to Yorktown to hopefully fight the British one last time. So he's got his troops camped in Chatham. And he's got French and British troops, French and American troops at this point, and they're camped there. Now, Henry Clinton, who's still in charge of the British in New York, he's not sure what Washington's going to do, but Washington wants him to think that he's going to invade New York. So he has these bread ovens built that can basically bake bread for thousands and thousands of troops. He has them light up the bread ovens, start baking bread, and in the middle of the night, he takes his troops and they silently go south. Clinton and his spies fall for it. They think he's got 5,000 troops out of Chatham. So they fall for this ruse, and those bread ovens were right on the Summit Municipal Golf Course. So he he gains a day, because by the time they figure it out, he's already pretty much crossing the Delaware and going south towards Yorktown. Okay, so what do we learn? We learned the last major fighting in the North during the Revolution was the Battle of Springfield. We know that the Continental Army, that it suffered so badly during the winter of 1779 to 1780, they fought bravely. The militia came out in force. We know that Hannah Caldwell is murdered. She becomes kind of the poster child for the Patriot cause. We know that James Caldwell says, "Give 'em Watts, boys." We know the British burn Elizabeth, Union, and Springfield pretty much to the ground. And George Washington will state after the Battle of Springfield, and I quote, "They flew to arms universally and acted with a spirit equal to anything I have seen in the course of the war." He's talking about the militia. Now, he didn't badmouth the militia early in the war, but he certainly had no trust or confidence in them. But in this case, he feels they've met his call. And Thomas Fleming, if you ever want to read something on the Battle of Springfield, Thomas Fleming had a great book. And in that, he compares the Battle of Springfield to Lexington and Concord, Yorktown, and other battles as of equal importance. And I want to do a last plug for one of my heroes, Benjamin Rush. Does anybody know who Benjamin Rush is? All right. So there's several biographies on this man. And I think he's super interesting because he is a philanthropist and a friend and a surgeon, and he's friends with all of these early founding fathers. And I don't know that you know this, but he was advisor to Thomas Paine and sent drafts of Common Sense to Benjamin Rush to review. Benjamin Rush was a surgeon in Philadelphia. He's fought smallpox. He's called the father of psychiatry. He's one of the first ones to come out and say, these people that are acting kooky, they're not possessed by the devil. They have psychiatric problems. So he's the father of modern psychiatry. One of the youngest signers of the Declaration. And I think most importantly, well, he's an abolitionist. He advocates for public schools. He does this behind the scenes. He's not looking for glory, but he's friends with all these guys, and he's friends with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And sometime after Jefferson leaves office, he starts to correspond with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and he says, look, you two, I know you're peeved at each other because you fought during this election of 1800, which was savage. You pretty much fought each other in the press. You now don't like each other, but you are the original founders of this nation, and you need to come back together as friends. And he writes a series of letters to each of them. So here's Benjamin Rush in the middle, writing a letter to John Adams, writing a letter to Jefferson, and back and forth. And he finally gets them together near, they're very much of old age at this point, and they start corresponding. And they write these loving letters between each other. And it's because of Benjamin Rush bringing them back together. And in their old age, they enjoy reminiscing about their early years in America. So he is a great human being, great individual. The only negative I can say is he was critical of George Washington at one point during the war. And some historians don't like him because of that, but I think was probably right. There were times in the war where George Washington was at a low. So this is about us, and these are the kiosks. I was talking about national park type kiosks. So you can see in the lower right, those are the types of national park type signs that we put up. So we have 2 up already. We have 1 planned for Summit. We have 1 planned for Springfield, Union, Elizabeth. So we're trying to get the word out about these battles, and we go into the schools. We have a newsletter, so you can visit us at this website if you want to learn more. And that's it.
This was fantastic. So if you have any questions, comments in here. I must say your wealth of knowledge is unbelievable, to the point that I believe that in 1780 you were actually there. And if you don't mind, I'm going to call you General Gula. So, Alan.
Thanks, Bob. It's nice you gave a big context around the battles. It was an excellent presentation. So I also wanted to point out, I'm from near Morristown, and you can go to Morristown and you can actually see stuff. You don't have to go to a ShopRite parking lot, see a battle. But no offense. But so in Morristown, we've got Washington's headquarters. How many people have been there? All right, good. And then we've got Jockey Hollow, right? Yep. Good. So my question was, and you brought it up at the end, about it being a civil war. And from what I've read, I read a lot of history, including military history. Both groups had the regular soldiers and the militias, but the American groups were less educated. They certainly weren't dressed as good as you are, right? Yeah, definitely. But and the Americans would loot, kill randomly. And this was in the Carolinas, Georgia, maybe less so in up north here, but you're telling us that they burn things down. The British and the Loyalists were better educated, and then the British Army, they had all these gentlemen that bought their commissions. So can you comment more about that?
Yeah. So it's interesting because overall, I think American colonists, British colonists, were better educated than most. I think your point about whether the American loyalists fighting were more vicious, I could tell you that the Hatfields out of Elizabethtown, I mentioned Cornelius Hatfield, and Cornelius Jr. was the one, he was quite vicious. He would lead British soldiers because he knew the area, he knew the roads, he knew whose house was what. He would lead the burden of houses. So I think the most vicious, and this is something I didn't mention because I'll go down a rabbit hole, but I'm in the middle of doing a documentary, like a 20-minute documentary film on the war at the shore. So remember I was telling you about the events that took place after Yorktown? So there was a number of events in the Jersey Shore that took place. My wife's family are the original Quakers from that area. So in celebration of the 250th, for her family reunion in Ohio, I'm doing a short film. And the New Jersey coast and the loyalist activity down there was savage. That was far worse. So on the Jersey Shore, you had privateering. that occurred. And these were people in the employ of the Congress of the United States attacking British ships. You had what are called refugees, which are just armed loyalists. And they would attack from the Pine Barrens. Pine Barrens was a great hideout. So if you wanted to hide out and you were a loyalist, you would hide out in the Pine Barrens. No one could find you. And then you would come out and you would attack your neighbor. And they attacked a lot of their neighbors. So there was, on the other side of that, were these committees created to penalize any kind of loyalists in communities like Toms River, which was then Dover Township. They had committees that would penalize you. They would make you sign an oath of allegiance. If they knew you were a loyalist, they'd take your property. So it was pretty vicious on both sides, but I think Monmouth County in particular had a lot of fighting between these groups. The only thing I'm aware of in Union County was the Elizabethtown Hatfield loyalist group. I'm not familiar with any real Springfield loyalists or, yeah, once you get west, until you get to Sussex County, I think it was pretty much patriot. But Monmouth County was a hotbed of it. Bergen County, same thing.
Thank you for the excellent talk. My ancestors were also involved in the revolution, but on the side of law and order. What's sort of up?
Who's
There was, of course, one successful British attack through the Watchtown in 1776 when Bantry Tarleton went up to Basking Ridge in a raid and caught General Lee.
Oh, yes. Caught him with his pants down.
With a lady,
Yeah.
right, and his pants down,
Yeah.
right. American general. What can I say? What you're sort of telling us in some ways, this is a long war, and it's different at the start and the end, and there's a lot more friction in New Jersey towards the end. It's hard to do raids. The sort of raids the British could do in 1776, they can't do in 1780. Because there's just more militia on both sides, making it more difficult to do this. And I think this is what you're really saying here, which speaks to a larger problem. The British didn't really have a strategy for winning, nor truthfully did the Americans, except wait it out. And just for the perspective of the story, the largest battle of the American Revolution was the Siege of Gibraltar, right? Not even fought on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. Right. So there's that perspective too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, I just watched this morning. There's my kids make fun of me. I have 5 kids and they're all kind of grown. Most of them are grown and off the payroll. But I watch C-SPAN and they make fun of me when they see me watching C-SPAN. Oh, look at the old man watching C-SPAN. But there was a gentleman speaking about the global aspects of the revolution and the fact that our Declaration of Independence spread around the world, and our success in the revolution, we talk about these major characters like General Washington, General Greene, all the big players, Benedict Arnold, et cetera. But we don't talk about the citizens' participation and the things they went through. We don't talk about the French and the fact that the French basically put us over the top. They were secretly supplying us with ammunition early in the war on the sly, and then they end up with troops and naval reinforcements. But I think it happened in so many places, and the British were spread so thin. Like you mentioned, they had to fight wars all over the place. The reason they were fighting in, basically all over the place against French, Spanish. They were defending their colonies elsewhere. And in this C-SPAN documentary, the author talks about, so he wrote a book about all this and the global impacts at that time of the revolution, the global impacts and afterwards. And he mentions the fact that that it had an influence on everyone. And yeah, I think it we certainly can thank the French for participating, the Spanish to some extent. And it had repercussions for later independence movements. And this author goes as far as to say the British actually should have said early in the war, and some in Parliament, I guess, said this, let's just let them go. Let them go and let's cut our losses and focus on these other colonies. And that's what they did afterwards. And they actually strengthened their empire elsewhere after the war.
I have two questions, and they're both based on hearsay, no fact that I know behind it. One was that those beacons that you mentioned were really ineffective, in that the first time they were used, they burned down and you didn't have them anymore. And in the dead of winter, to rebuild them just wasn't going to happen. The second, was there any battles that were fought around Scotch Plains and Plainfield that affected any of this?
Well, there's a battle. To your first question, the first question was they would have rebuilt them. Washington's instructions were, once they were lit, they would have been lit before, with the first invasion of Connecticut Farms, they would have been lit then, and then they would have been relit on the second invasion 2 weeks later at Springfield. So the instructions that he gave to the militia and Continentals in charge of each of those beacons was that it had to be rebuilt. So that's number one. Number two was, what was your second question now? So the battle you're referring to in Plainfield, and it took place, part of it on Plainfield Golf Club, was the Battle of the Short Hills, which took place, I think it was 1778, 77. So the Battle of the Short Hills took place in that area, just on the southern end of the Watchung Mountain Range. And you can go and you can walk around and visit. Some of it's undeveloped, and there is a walking trail, but it does skirt part of Plainfield Golf Club. And when Plainfield Golf Club wanted to do renovations to their course, they had to consider the fact that some of the battle took place on what's now the golf course. So there was a battle there, and it was significant. It wasn't the size of this battle that we talked about, but that was the Battle of the Short Hills, not Short Hills as we know it up here.
You mentioned the film Turn. I like to watch history. My wife likes to watch all kinds of other stuff. We rarely watch the same TV show. So I'm sitting there watching Turn, and she was doing something else beside it. And at the third episode, hey, that's neat. So we went back to the first episode and started rewatching it. It's a great series. It's on Netflix now. It's free. It's not always free on Netflix. It is now. So if you want to watch Turn, now's the time to do it. So now, Forgotten Victory Trail. I'm sure you guys have accept donations somehow. Why don't you tell the group to take a minute and just help them understand. It'll be recorded on there. So if you want to.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned that our initiatives are education. I go into the grammar schools, and each year I do about 1,200 students in the local, it's usually fourth or fifth grade when they cover the Revolution. So I cover these battles, and the kids, as I mentioned in some of the slides, they're amazed. They're like, wow, that was right next to my house. Oh, I go to Five Guys. Oh, I get on the Parkway. So we do education programs in the schools. We do these this year, many more of these type lectures for historical societies and libraries. We do have an interactive map and a website which covers timeline, battlefields, stories, people, and we do these kiosks, so signage. Signage is the third part of our mission, and we feel like we need better signage. We have roadside signs that exist by Connecticut Farms Church, by Caldwell Parsonage, but there are no real large, significant signs which give you the full history. And those giant maps that I showed you, with the 1781 map, for example, that's on each one of our kiosks and shows the overall strategies. And then the local side of each kiosk has a drill down into the community and the historic sites relating to the revolution in that community. So we have a lot of good things going on, and it's a busy year. And it's our hope that we can put more of these signs in the ground and get more kids educated. So,
And how can people donate?
so you can go to forgottenvictory.com, which, yeah, forgottenvictory.com, which is pretty straightforward. And we have a PayPal system where you could donate. Or if you want to get involved with our organization, you could become a member. We certainly could use help. Any kind of participation is welcome. So lots of good plans, fun stuff.
Okay, and we have this presentation, which I'm sure will be placed in your most valuable part of your room.
will.
It's a thank you for what you've done. It also displays the orchid, which Summit was the orchid capital of the East at once it was founded. Oh, of course he knows that. So that's our first part. The second part is our general thank you. The old Garson was. Thank you.
And one last thing. And this is a plug for the potential sign that the Summit Park line. And I know you mentioned it earlier with regard to Dr. Hankinson, but he's part of the board of the Summit Park line is a walking path that is, and there was a presentation done to you guys a few years back by Dr. Rubino, but that walking path, we're going to have one of these large signs on that walking path because it's not far from Bryant's Tavern and Bryant Park. So you can see at parts of this trail from above, you could see the sites from the Battle of Springfield. So it's our intention to have one of these signs there. So if you wanted to contribute to that specific sign, you have the ability to do it through us.